I've always been interested in the digital tools that one can use as a designer. And that goes back to the very beginnings of me working as a designer, and that's a long time ago. I can always remember being fascinated by the first fax machine, for example, in my first job in Hong Kong. And while that isn't digital fashion, it's a digital tool that started to change how things work in the industry. As I progressed in my career, and I went from being a designer through to design director of a large group, I introduced use of Adobe technology and Net Graphics for development of textiles in CAD. And I tried to transform the design studio. And one of the focuses on this was in getting things accurate, in reducing waste, in looking at how you could develop many, many different options of designs and iterations of designs from textiles and coloration through print and actual garment. The interaction with pattern cutting and laying and manufacturing came along, which also had a great impact on how things work in the industry and on cutting delivery times, on cutting waste, and making things much more responsive to what was happening at the sales floor. Apart from that, as everything developed, I became very much more interested in how design within a computer environment was happening. I joined Amphi in Amsterdam, working with Leslie, and joining their program, I was then involved with working with Lectra, specifically for the Denim Miner program, where we started to look at how you could design fully in the computer and translate and transform for production, and found that to be a really fascinating field to focus on. At the Digital Fashion Group, we have developed a skills program, 3Design, the fundamentals of digital fashion design, where we use Clo 3D as the main software. And we see this as being an essential piece of software for digital transformation in the fashion industry and for supporting the creative designer in really digitizing their process from A to Z.